Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you, Alberto, for inviting me to come here to Krop and to Bergen University. I want to talk to you, first of all, about some basic elements. It's going to be a little bit of jumping here and there, because I'm going to be touching on topics of different disciplines. But all of them, I want you to keep in mind, all of them are related to different elements of the SDGs. If I talk about poverty, if I talk about equity, SDGs 5 and 10, and if I talk about economic growth, which is related to SDGs 8 and 9. But once I do that, I want to talk more specifically about the idea of a transformative green economy, because that's where the different elements come together in an attempt to be transdisciplinary and to try to understand how synergies work across the different elements. And because of my background and my own interest, I don't want to stay purely on the academic realm, although there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, but I do want to talk about policy implications and to draw out a couple of examples, which, by the way, are updated from the version that Alberto mentioned from the book. It was 2016, right? That book came out. So first, let me talk a little bit about poverty. And the approach we take in UNICEF and more broadly in the UN about poverty is that it's based on human rights. As you know, unfortunately and tragically, human rights are violated throughout the world all the time, sometimes in really brutal and grotesque ways. However, not everything that is wrong, not everything that is bad is poverty. Poverty is related to some specific rights violations, the ones that we call constitutive rights, rights that constitute poverty, and those are related mainly with material deprivations. And I'm going to come back to this issue of the link between the elements which constitute poverty, multidimensional poverty, which are related to health and nutrition and education, etc., and the corresponding SDGs. So that's point number one. Point number two, the SDGs also talk about equity. And some people ask, why? Why do we have an SDG which is about equity if we already have an SDG which is about poverty? Aren't they the same thing? Well, I will try to show graphically why we think those are two different elements. I'm assuming that everybody is familiar with the idea of a poverty line, a certain level of monetary income or expenditure below which you are considered poor and which you have to surpass in order to be considered to be above poverty. On the vertical axis, I'm going to measure income. You could have an expenditure, is the same thing. And I'm going to show an example where we have 5 individuals and the height of the individual measures their level of income. I want you to look at this graph and tell me how many people are poor in this graph.
2.
Very good, 2. And 2 out of 5 is what percentage? What's the incidence of poverty?
40.
I don't believe you, but yes, if I press the button, it shows 40. So 40 must be the right answer. So we have 40% poverty. Time elapses, and this is the situation that we have with the same 5 individuals. Are we better off? What's the incidence? How many people are poor in this case?
20.
How many people have income that falls short of the poverty line?
3.
Venture a number, I'm not going to hit you.
3.
60%.
How many are below the poverty line? 1 is below the poverty line. 1 out of 5 is 20%. Which means we have been able to cut poverty in half. Are we better off? If you look at the situation, you can see that the first person, the poorest of the poor, has an income which is half of what it was before. The next person basically has the same income, just marginally went up the poverty line, but his or her life is exactly the same as it was before. All the other members of society, or most of the other ones, the ones that you could have considered the heart of the middle class, their income has been slashed. They're still not poor, but they're certainly worse off. And only one is really better off, but that's the person who was better off to begin with. So it's very difficult to think that the situation is better, and that's because inequality has increased dramatically. And inequality can increase even if poverty goes down. And vice versa, you could have poverty going up and inequality going down. These are two different problems, and it's important to understand that they are different if we're going to tackle them with the appropriate policies. Now, going to my fourth element of another conceptual issue that we have to think of is the idea of economic growth and the idea of transformational growth. And I want to underline the idea of transformational growth because it challenges the traditional mainstream orthodox view that most economists have. Most economists work under the idea that markets lead or move towards some sort of equilibrium. And probably the best that you can get out of that tradition is the idea that the equilibrium itself can move in a situation of steady growth, where all the variables are increasing roughly at the same time. There is an ontological premise based on how we understand the essence of reality that says steady state economic growth does not exist. And the basis for that is that when we actually check the data, the evidence, economic growth is irregular. It looks like this. There is no steady state. However, the fact that there is no steady state does not mean that economic growth is random. On the contrary, there are patterns in terms of economic growth, but those patterns change. They are not always the same. That's why we can speak of an old and a new economic cycle, where the characteristics of the economic cycle are different depending on the different type of institutions, the technology, and the market structures that dominate in a particular period of time, in a particular place. But these structures, these institutions, these technologies also change, and they evolve endogenously, they evolve together, and that's how they introduce complexity into the system. As the economy grows in a way that has a pattern but is irregular and not random, income distribution changes. And these changes in income distribution are at the root of inequality and poverty. But it's not all bad, because as we change the market structures and the technology, we also change the consumption patterns. And when we change the consumption patterns, we have an opening to change the consumption patterns in a way that our consumption could be more sustainable. And that's related to SDG number 12. Now, these will not happen automatically. The market by itself would not lead necessarily towards more sustainable consumption patterns. That needs to be part of the policy. It has to come out of the result of policy. Now, how can we ground the policy? How can we think about it? As I mentioned in the introduction, I wanted to touch base on all of these different concepts and try to put them together under the idea of a transformative green economy, an idea which is not really new. It has certain antecedents, and those are all over the world. Let me start, because I think it's appropriate, being in Norway, to talk about the famous philosopher Ness, whose work, I hope that's the way you pronounce it.
Ness.
Ness. I hope it was close enough. Anyway, famous Norwegian philosopher and environmentalist activist who talked about deep ecology when he was thinking, as an early precursor of sustainability science, that we not only have to control pollution, but we have to do that in a way that increases equality. And not just equality among human beings, but equality across all of nature, so that individuals could have a life worth living. And this is impossible to achieve in a simple way. What a lot of people miss is that this is connected, very much so, in particular when we try to monitor and measure changes, with the idea of the happiness index, which comes out of Bhutan and comes from a completely different philosophical grounding. And a different philosophical grounding exists in the Andean mountains in Latin America, where they talk about the idea of good living and connecting all forms of living in a pattern of production and consumption which is different from the market-based one that we're used in the West. And this would lead to a plentiful life where we can live in communion with nature and live happier lives. So all of these different perspectives, different philosophical groundings, all lead to the same idea that we have to be thinking of how to connect what we eat with what we produce and how we produce it and the effect it has on nature and the effect it has on us. At the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development, UNRIS, based in Geneva, they have come up with a similar concept. They call it transformative change, and it has different components. It's a people-centered approach to try to think how the economy should work, taking into account economic but also social and environmental concerns. All of this, of course, is complex, and then we start to get into the thick of understanding complexity and how it works and how can we use it for policy. The first step, a very simple step, a step that connects just two elements. Child poverty on the one hand, and as I mentioned earlier, child poverty we measure in terms of constitutive rights that make for poverty. It's a multidimensional approach. In Mauritania, we measure this at the subnational level, and we have a very interesting, I would not say beautiful because it shows very high levels of poverty, but a very interesting distribution of the incidence of poverty. We can overlay this map with a map that shows the risk of flooding so that we can connect two elements, poverty and environmental risk. And we can do an analysis which allows us to say where should we put our efforts to help people where it hurts the most in the connection between a social deprivation and an environmental risk. But as I said, this is just two elements. There are way more complex causalities which go in different directions. In this example, I want to talk about nutrition and water and sanitation and education and health, which, as I mentioned earlier, are part of the constitutive rights that make for poverty. And we know that nutrition affects health. If you have better nutrition, you're more likely to have better health. We also know if you're better fed, you do better in school. We also know that if you have access to water and sanitation, you're likely not to fall ill, so you're going to have better nutrition. So it's connected to both nutrition and health. Better education means you know how to do things better, you know how to use soap and water, it means you know how to boil water, etc., etc., etc. So education is good for health, but we also know if you're healthy, you do better in school. If you're well educated, you know how to use water. I mentioned this before. There is a collection. I'm not going to bore you with all the other connections because this is a mesh. It's a web of interconnections, what we call the micro-level synergy, which produces social development, and it's related to several of the SDGs. Is this clear so far? Good. Because I'm going to change track a little bit. This is the micro-level synergy. I want to talk now about more macro processes. And I want you to think about the relationship between economic growth and social development. What I mean by I want you to think about it is I want you to picture in your head the relationship between economic growth and social development. I'm going to measure social development by under 5 mortality rates. It's a very good, succinct measure of how society is doing because it captures access to health, access to food, access to water. It also captures the impact of parents' education in the well-being of the child. So nature by itself gives us a summary measure of social development. So I want you to think about it. If there is economic growth, and there is higher and higher economic growth, what's going to happen with under 5 mortality rate? Is it going to go up or is it going to go down? I want you to think, imagine that relationship. Is it going up? It's a U curve, up or down? What is it? Put it in your head. Is this what you thought the relationship was like? Because there is no relationship. Economic growth does not lead to social development. At least it does not lead to social development by itself. And the reason for that is that there are issues related to equity. We need the intervention of active and thought out and planned policy. And of course there is the issue of complexities. So we have to keep on thinking about those synergies in terms of the different elements and how they interact with each other. The example I was just giving is social development, and how social development can contribute to promote economic growth, and in some instances, economic growth facilitates social development. However, neither social development nor economic growth by itself is sufficient nor necessary to support the other one. There are complex relationships. Is this clear? Okay. Now, let me try to center these macro relationships and the other ones that I mentioned earlier, centered on the individual. An individual that works, an individual that works and consumes. Now, hopefully, if the individual works on an activity that provides high value added, and the worker is enjoying labor rights, and the worker is engaged in an activity that produces something that is ecologically or socially useful, and the worker is well paid, then we're going to have, through the higher value added economic growth, the well-paid element produces poverty reduction, we have environmental sustainability, and we know that poverty reduction helps with social development. Environmental sustainability also helps us with poverty reduction. We saw the map in Mauritania. And environmental sustainability also helps with economic growth. Again, I'm not going to show all the possible interactions, nor mention all of them, because I don't want you to fall asleep in the middle of the presentation. Just let it be said that there are various feedback loops that we need to understand, we need to analyze, we need to quantify. Moreover, we want the worker to be happy. The worker has to be engaged in work that is enjoyable if we're going to have a life worth living, as Ness used to say. I have centered this part of the presentation on the individual worker. That is because of the way I'm going to present some of the policy examples. However, an approach that is people-centered is not the same thing as an individualistic approach. And I think this is important as we think of the connection between the policies, poverty reduction, social inclusion, and the fulfillment of the SDGs and environmental protection. If we are individualistic, we're never going to achieve any of those goals. So, we have complexity, we have synergies that are under the umbrella of this transformative green economy, which builds on different concepts from different sciences. Now, how do we do it? How do we engage in policy making that helps us with this? Well, let me tell you how we are not going to do it. And the way not to do it is to think of the famous question, if you had $1 million, then what would you do? In which basket are you going to put all your eggs? In this particular example, the choice is between investing in primary education or investing in universities. Classical dilemma that all governments in developing countries are put to the test. And if we ask the question this way, it means that whatever we give to one, we have to take away from the other one. In which case, there is one and only one best solution, and it's a technical solution. It has nothing to do with politics. This is what I call the neoclassical trap. It's just the way the question is asked that leads to a particular answer. As the Greek philosopher said, if you ask the question properly, you already have half the answer. And this is not the right question. And it's not the right question for at least two reasons. Reason number one, it obscures that there is a dynamic aspect. It's not a choice between primary education or university. That would be a choice if you ask me today. But if I'm thinking about growth, transformational growth, a transformative green economy which is dynamic and complex, it's a dynamic question. And we have to connect the immediate problem, which deals with the cohort we're discussing today, but also with the cohort coming next year and the year after that. Then the problem is a completely different problem, and that question that was asked earlier is an irrelevant question. That's why it's a trap. We need to be able to link these goals. Moreover, the question itself is tricky because it assumes that we only have $1 million. Why not $2 million? So, how can we go from $1 million to $2 million? That leads me back to a group of economists that was very popular a few years back. Maybe you heard of them, the Fiscocrats. They were very popular in the 70s, but not in the 1970s, in the 1770s, about 250 years ago. These are economists that were writing even prior to Adam Smith. And basically what they said can be captured in the following diagram. Imagine that that rectangle is everything that's produced in the economy, the famous pie chart, right? This is all the economy has. We can divide this in basically 3 parts. There is the element that is needed for the reproduction of society, the private reproduction of society. I have to eat today so that I can go to work, so I can have money to eat tomorrow and go to work tomorrow. And for my children, when I die, my children will replace me. That's what society needs to happen. You could include there some elements of investment if you want to replenish productive capacity. So that's part of what we do. Then we have social services, productive public spending, because I cannot on my own get everything that I need for the social reproduction. Like, for example, education. We need schools. If I'm going to go to work, we need roads. I cannot build my own road to go to work. So some of what we produce today needs to be channeled outside of my own private consumption so we can all consume it together, and that's also necessary for reproduction of society. But all societies in human history, all of them, if they don't have this element, they collapse. They all have extra. That's the produit net, the production, the net production above and beyond what we need to survive. And we use that, we consume that privately, but not for the social reproductions, not needed in that sense, and it's not for doing anything particularly useful. You can think of the Egyptian pyramids, or you can think of Gothic cathedrals. I mean, beautiful cathedrals that required a lot of human effort, but did not serve any major practical purpose. So, the point is that currently, today, in the world we live, we have a particular allocation among these 3 chunks of production which maintains a situation of gross inequality, abject poverty, despair, and ill-being. So we need to increase the resources that we have in the public realm so that we can have more productive public spending that will allow us to invest in social development, but do it in a way that does not hurt the environment. The challenge to do this is to do it while maintaining the incentives for private production, as long as private production is driven by private profit, and also political acceptance, because at some point we have to change some of the rules of the game. So how can we do this? How can we channel resources so that they would enhance social well-being and they will enhance environmental sustainability and still try to maintain some of the current rules of the game? There are many ways to do that. I'm just going to give one example. The example I'm going to give is centered in fiscal policy. But I want to emphasize is one example, is one entry point. Because of the complexity of the transformative green economy, we could have different entry points, but I don't have time to deal with all of them. So in terms of fiscal policy, I want to highlight three elements. First one, progressive taxation. That leads to income distribution, and that helps us with poverty reduction. But fiscal policy is also used to provide different types of incentives so that we promote value-adding activities that promote economic growth. This could be anything from subsidies to certain type of production or subsidies to certain type of consumption. For example, many countries provide subsidies to the purchase of electric cars or solar panels. So this is part of what fiscal policy does. The other one is that the fiscal policy also involves the expenditure that we can, as policy choices, gear towards more socially useful or more socially useful elements which provide human and social development. What seems to be missing here is the environment. SDGs 7 and 13, 14, and 16. Now, some of you now might say or might think, this is all very interesting. He has shown some arrows going up and down. He mentioned the word synergy 2-3 times. He mentioned the word complexity 2-3 times. He showed a colorful map. But little evidence so far of anything that I have mentioned or that I proposed. So let me tell you what is the actual experience across developing countries in terms of the connection between social and economic development. For that, I'm going to show you the relationship between social development, again measured in terms of reduction in under 5 mortality, and monetary poverty. I'm going to show the connection between the two. Now this is no simple 2x2 example. It's a 3x3 example, so I need your help to go through the numerical example. Are you ready to help me go through the example?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I have something like 65 or 70 countries. I'm going to put them, I'm going to rank them in terms of those that started with high or medium or low monetary poverty, and I'm going to classify countries into those three groups. Do you see the three groupings? High, medium, and low income poverty. Do you see them? Okay. Then I'm going to classify countries in three groups: high, medium, and low under 5 mortality. Obviously, if you have high under 5 mortality, it means you have low social development. And again, we have three groups. Do you see the three groups? Do you see the three groups? Okay, so now I have classified these 65 or 70 countries or so in 9 groups, because I have 3-way classification for poverty, 3-way classification for social development. Are you with me? So now I have 9 cells. What is in the cells? What is in the cells is the average annual per capita economic growth in the 10 years following the measurement of under 5 mortality and poverty. So under 5 and poverty, another way to say this is the level of social development and poverty that we start with is the beginning. And then we see what happens in terms of economic growth afterwards. Let's look at what happens with countries that start with high poverty, monetary poverty, and low social development. Those countries actually in the next 10 years on average tanked. They reduced per capita income at the rate of 1.5% per year. This is a reduction of almost 20% in 10 years, because it accumulates, right? It's 1.5, but it's 1.5 from the previous one. Now, for those countries that started with some sort of medium level of monetary poverty and good social development, those were able to increase per capita income. This is not economic growth like when we say, oh, you know, the booming economy in China or Malawi, they grow 10%. No, no, this is per capita, 2% every year. But those countries that started with very low poverty and very high social development, they grew at 2.7% every year on average. This is pretty good in terms of economic growth. However, the question still lingers. What about the environment? Because this was economic growth. I don't know. I don't know if that economic growth was sustainable or not. Is this clear? Okay. So let's look at what happens in Porto Alegre, Brazil. Maybe I should say what used to happen. I'm not exactly sure what's going on right now in Brazil. So in any case, in Porto Alegre, in Brazil, many, many years ago, they started several projects at the same time. One of them was based on the idea of participatory budget making, where there were groups of people throughout the city that got together into thematic groups and were able to aggregate and translate their desires, their wants, what they consider needs, to the members of the municipal assembly that were putting the budget together, and about 15–20% of the budget was to be allocated based on the preferences of the directly measured of the population. But they also engaged in a series of activities of cooperation between the government, the city government, and the private sector, and NGOs to make sure that different types of jobs would be created. Like, for example, the Beekeepers Association that instituted a health control seal that allowed them to produce honey, which, because it was certified as pure, as healthy, as organic, could be exported. And then there was a boom in that export market. And there are many other examples like that. They also changed the school curriculum in order to introduce their ideas about sustainability and environmental concerns. And of course, for the very young children, this is just part of the education and information sharing, but for the older children and adolescents, it also allowed for their participation and discussions, both at school and family and in the thematic groups, on what to do, how to deal with some of the environmental issues, which led to better policy planning. All of these resulting in a period of 10 years, for example, doubling the coverage of the sewage system, which increased the availability of clean water, healthy disposal of excreta, which of course increased health and it's a better environment in which to live. So, how does all of this relate to what I was mentioning earlier in terms of complexity, in terms of the different connections and synergies across the different elements? Well, let me start again with the individual, the person that has to get up and go to work every day. First of all, in Porto Alegre, for the garbage collection and recycling, the workers, and this is maybe perfectly normal to you in Norway, but believe me, it's not normal at all in Latin America or most of the developing world, these workers became formal workers with a proper contract. And they were formally excluded and marginalized. Now they were part of a social inclusion process. They connected the recycling centers, where a lot of the workers were female, with Centers for Better Women, to try to address issues of gender inequality and gender-based violence. The workers were trained so they could get other higher level in terms of value-adding activities, jobs. And also because, I don't know what your experience is, but when I was growing up, nobody in my school, when asked what you want to do when you grow up, said garbage collector. People usually prefer other types of. There is nothing wrong with being a garbage collector, but it's usually not the most fun thing to do. But also the work that these people were doing helped with urban sanitation, which means less infection and less epidemics. All of this means that through gender equality we contribute to social development. If we train people to get more value-adding jobs, we produce economic growth. The formal employment and the elimination of social exclusion leads to poverty reduction. Sanitation is related to environmental sustainability, and we see how, starting with a simple, concrete example of the particular type of job that policymakers have to promote. These did not come naturally. There is no invisible hand that's going to produce this automatically. But then we can start to unleash in different directions all the synergies that we need for the transformative green economy. Now, some of you might think, okay, well, that's a neat example, but that's just one. Okay, I'll give you another one. India. In India, there is an employment guarantee scheme that is intended to enhance the livelihood of the rural poor. And it creates assets through the work that the rural people do. They can save, but they can also, so they save internally within the family because they get more income, but also the work they do provides for infrastructure which is good for the community. There are also, as in Brazil, participatory processes that it strengthens local governance, it's decentralized, there are accountability mechanisms, there is also the use of innovative technologies which help to track and help to plan by pinpointing where the problems are. How does the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme work in India? It is not a surprise. By now, I think for you, it should not be a surprise. It starts with the individual that has to get up every morning, send the children to school, and go to work. So, in India, these poor rural workers have guaranteed 100 days of employment on an unskilled manual work, because there is no assumption that all of these unemployed poor rural people are neurosurgeons or engineers. So they have to be doing the type of jobs that are offered to them has to be something that absolutely everybody should be able to do. But the focus is on rural women, and especially with those rural women that come from the most marginalized group, what are called the scheduled tribes, castes and tribes in India. And a lot of the work they do is on things that will increase productivity in agriculture by providing management of irrigation and water systems. But also this leads to water conservation and soil conservation. If we have more social inclusion, as I said, through the employment of more rural women, we lead to social development. Because we have investment in irrigation projects, we have economic growth. Having guaranteed jobs for 100 days increases my income. It allows me to surpass the poverty line. Because there is water conservation, we promote environmental sustainability, and you see how all these elements interact and work together through a combination of feedback loops and synergies, exploiting in a positive way the complexities of the transformative green economy. So, what are the conclusions, and what is the way forward? There are two types of conclusions. One of them, some of them, are methodological and relate to the theoretical underpinning. We need to understand, hopefully we should be able to measure and quantify the different feedback loops. We need to do the network analysis, thinking of how all these synergies work with each other. This is related to the theoretical concept of transformational growth, and it should be transdisciplinary. The way I like to say it is social policy meets environmental science. We need to work together in order to have new and more elaborate conceptual frameworks with which to analyze these complex problems together. The second type of conclusions are practical, and they relate to the policy making. And here we cannot separate the issue of rights, of workers' rights, with economic growth. Economic growth that should ensure environmental sustainability, It has to be done through the promotion of value-adding activities. It has to address poverty and inequality. It has to promote social development, and it also has to provide rewarding, enjoyable work in clean facilities. Because here the objective is not to just promote economic growth. That's not the objective. Nor is the objective just to protect the environment. It's to allow us all to have full, rich, enjoyable lives. And what we need to achieve that goal is many more examples so that we can tell the governments this is what we need, this is what we want in order to have those enjoyable, fulfilling lives where our material needs are satisfied, but are satisfied in a way that makes our home, which is not just the apartment I live, like our home is the earth, be able to sustain and be healthy through time. And there is no better way to do that than to remember the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who said that in this world there is enough for everybody's needs, but not for everybody's greed. And that's the kind of shift we need to do to make transformative green economies a reality. Thank you very much for your time and attention.